The day I buried my husband was the same day I truly lost my son. Not to grief, not to shock, not to the kind of crushing sorrow that splits a soul open and leaves a person unrecognizable for months. No, I lost my son Daniel that Tuesday morning in November when my phone rang at 7:42 a.m., before the hearse had even arrived, before the lilies had been arranged on the casket, before I had even managed to button my black dress without my hands shaking so badly that I had to sit down on the bathroom floor just to breathe. And then his voice came through the speaker, calm as if he were reading a weather update. "Mom, I'm not going to make it. It's Rachel's birthday. We already have reservations." 7 words. Just 7 words to explain why a grown man would not be standing at his father's graveside. "We already have reservations." I stood there in that bathroom, the phone pressed tightly against my ear, and I felt something inside me shift, not break. I want to be clear about that. What happened in my chest that morning was not breaking. It was more like something setting, like a bone that had been fractured for a long time, quietly, invisibly, finally locking itself into a new position, hard, permanent, irreversible. "All right, Daniel," I said. That was all. I ended the call, finished buttoning my dress, and went downstairs to bury the man I had loved for 41 years. Let me tell you about my husband first, because none of this makes sense without him. Robert Calloway was not a flawless man. He was stubborn in the way men of his generation often were, slow to apologize, quicker to silence than words, the kind of father who showed love by being present rather than by speaking it. He coached Daniel's little league team for 6 years, even while working 50-hour weeks. He drove 4 hours through a snowstorm just to watch Daniel's college graduation. He taught him how to change a tire, how to shake a hand firmly, how to look someone in the eye. He was there in every way that mattered. And when Robert was diagnosed with congestive heart failure 3 years ago, Daniel was noticeably, repeatedly, painfully absent. It began small, as these things often do. Missed Sunday dinners, phone calls that went to voicemail and were returned days later like a task being checked off a list. Holidays cut short because Rachel had her own family, her own traditions, her own mother who apparently needed Daniel's presence so often that nothing was left for us. I told myself it was natural, that a married man moves into his wife's world. I told myself Robert and I had done our job, that we had raised him well and let him go. But then Robert worsened, and Daniel only became busier. The hospital visits began 18 months before Robert died. 4 of them, each one a fresh wave of fear. Each one a chance for Daniel to appear at the doorway, to sit by the bed, to simply exist beside his father the way his father had always existed beside him. He came to 2. The first time was brief, 40 minutes, because they had theater tickets that evening they didn't want to waste. The second time he didn't come at all because they were in Cancun for their anniversary, and flights were expensive. Robert never once complained. That was what hurt the most. My husband, who had given his entire adult life to that boy, would ask about Daniel with the same mild tone you might use to ask about the weather, as if he had already made peace with disappointment so long ago it had become part of him. "He's busy," Robert would say. "He's got his own life," and I would just nod and hold his hand. Daniel was our only child. That matters. There was no sibling to share the weight, no second child to soften the absence. Everything we had built, the house, the savings Robert worked 40 years for, the lake property in Vermont that had been in his family for generations, everything was meant for Daniel. The will reflected that completely, simple, direct, written when Daniel was still someone we believed would always stay close. Robert never changed it. I think part of him kept waiting for Daniel to return to himself, to step back into who he used to be. He believed the distance was temporary, that Rachel's influence had limits, that eventually our son would find his way back. He didn't. Robert died on a Wednesday morning in November, in the bedroom we had shared for 38 years, my hand in his, autumn light falling through the curtains, and Daniel's name was the last word he ever said. I called Daniel from the hospital parking lot. I told him his father was gone. He said, "Oh, Mom, I'm so sorry." There was noise behind him, music, voices, the unmistakable sound of a restaurant. "Where are you?" I asked. A pause. "We're just at dinner." I didn't ask more. I told him the funeral would be Tuesday, and I needed him there. He said, "Of course." He said, "Obviously." He said, "Mom, I will be there, I promise." He never asked how I was. He never asked if I needed anything. He never offered to come earlier, not once in those 5 days. Those 5 days I spent receiving neighbors, arranging flowers, selecting music, choosing photographs with my sister Margaret, who flew in without being asked and slept on my couch and made me eat soup when I forgot. With Robert's brother Theodore, who cried openly in my kitchen and told me stories about Robert I had never heard. The house was full of people who loved him. Daniel called twice. Both times brief, both times I could hear Rachel in the background. Then came the morning of the funeral, 7:42 a.m., when he told me he wasn't coming. Reservations, Rachel's birthday. There is a certain silence that falls when someone important is missing from a funeral. The church was full, over 300 people. Robert had been respected, loved, known. But Daniel's seat beside me stayed empty. People noticed. They always do. My sister held my hand and didn't ask a question. That told me everything. Theodore gave the eulogy and cried at the end so openly that the entire room seemed to break with him. And then we went to the graveside, and I stood there in the cold air and said goodbye to my husband. I drove home alone. I made tea. Then I called my lawyer. I am not a bitter woman. I have thought about that decision many times since, and I need to be honest about what it was. It was not revenge. It was clarity. Robert had built something over 40 years, carefully, patiently, and I chose where it would go. The new will was prepared over 2 weeks. I left Daniel $1. I know how that sounds, but everything else went somewhere intentional. 20% to Theodore, 30% to my sister Margaret, 20% split among Robert's longtime employees, men who had stood beside him for decades, 30% to a heart foundation in his name. That felt right. That felt like him. I did not tell Daniel. He found out 6 months later when the will was read. I had not seen him in person since the funeral. He sent occasional texts. Flowers arrived late with a card signed by someone else's assistant. He remembered birthdays in fragments, small gestures that somehow felt emptier than nothing. When he walked into the lawyer's office with Rachel, she looked confident, expecting something positive. Daniel looked like his father. He always had. Same jaw, same posture, same way of holding his shoulders. The will was read. I watched his face shift as he understood. Rachel understood first. I saw it in her expression before Daniel did. The adjustment, the realization. $1, he said quietly. Mom, I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel triumph. I felt something heavier, the sadness of watching consequences land exactly where they were meant to. He called me for 2 weeks after that. Then Rachel called. Then lawyers got involved. There were threats of challenges, claims about emotional state. It went nowhere. Everything had been documented properly, cleanly, legally. Then one Sunday, Daniel came to my house alone. He stood on my porch in the rain without an umbrella. That detail stayed with me. Always does. He looked smaller somehow, less managed. I missed the funeral, he said. There's no excuse. No, I said. There isn't. He asked if anything could be done. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw both the boy I raised and the man who hadn't been there when it mattered. You can come inside, I said. He did. I made coffee. We talked for hours. Not the surface kind of talk we had fallen into over the years, but something deeper, more painful, more honest. He cried. I cried. He said things I had waited years to hear. I said things I had held too long. Nothing changed the will. Nothing changed the past. But something shifted between us, slowly, quietly. The money was already gone. The decisions already made. But my son stayed at that kitchen table until the rain stopped and the light faded, and for the first time in a long time, I believed he meant what he said. Robert used to say that people don't come back from comfort, they come back from consequence. I didn't understand that then. I think I do now. We visit Robert's grave on Wednesdays now. Daniel comes most weeks. He brings flowers without being reminded. He stands there in silence, and sometimes I see it in his face, that weight of realization that arrives too late to undo anything, but not too late to change what comes next. I think about those 7 words sometimes. We already have reservations, and I think about a man who never once let anything matter more than his family, who built a life of presence instead of absence, and whose last word was still his son's name. Some lessons come gently. Others arrive fully formed in consequences that cannot be reversed. But sometimes, just sometimes, they still leave room for something after. A son standing in the rain, finally willing to come inside.